The pre-recorded boisterous laughter drowned out the faint dying heartbeat of a starving teenager on set. America enthusiastically applauded the comedic teenager, unaware of his decaying mind that would ultimately end with a rope tied to a tree in the freezing forest. At the center, the radiant, well-behaved eldest son transformed into a power-obsessed fanatic, ruthlessly crushing his co-star's career with a single threat. Growing Pains was never the healing haven of the 1980s. It was a brightly lit crime scene where the television machine nonchalantly drained the lives and suffocated the minds of children to generate hundreds of millions of dollars in profit. This machine did not employ human beings. It mass-produced rigid, inescapable stereotypes. The television ecosystem of the 1980s relied heavily on established character archetypes. Every successful sitcom required a specific ensemble to function properly: the wise father, the patient mother, the rebellious teen, the precocious child. But perhaps the most structurally necessary yet psychologically demanding role was that of the comic relief sidekick. This character existed solely to offset the dramatic tension of the main plot, to deliver the punchlines, and to make the protagonist look cooler, smarter, or more grounded by comparison. In the architecture of Growing Pains, that essential weight-bearing pillar of comedy was Richard Stabone, universally known to audiences by a nickname that immediately signaled his role as the resident fool, Boner. The actor tasked with bringing this caricature to life was Andrew Koenig. The tragedy that eventually claimed his life was rooted in a severe cognitive dissonance between the intellectual man Andrew Koenig actually was and the two-dimensional jester he was contracted to play. Andrew was not an accidental actor pulled from an open casting call. He was born into Hollywood royalty, though of a very specific intellectual variety. His father, Walter Koenig, is an icon of science fiction, forever cemented in cultural history as Pavel Chekhov on the original Star Trek series. Growing up in a household steeped in the arts, literature, and the complex realities of the entertainment industry, Andrew developed a sharp, analytical mind. He was naturally inquisitive, deeply sensitive to the world around him, and possessed a quiet, introspective intelligence. He was a thinker, a writer, and a young man who felt the heavy emotional currents of the world. Yet, when the cameras rolled on the ABC soundstage, Andrew was required to suppress his intellect entirely. The character of Boner was written as Mike Seaver's affable but incredibly dim-witted best friend. If Mike, played by Kirk Cameron, was the charming schemer, Boner was the clueless accomplice who inevitably ruined the plan. The scripts demanded that Andrew play the fool week after week. He was given the most absurd dialogue, the most physical comedy, and the most humiliating plot lines. His job was to walk into the Seaver kitchen, misunderstand a basic concept, deliver a fractured punchline, wait for the studio audience to erupt in laughter, and then exit the scene. For a young actor, landing a recurring role on a hit network sitcom is the ultimate career victory. It brings financial security, national recognition, and a degree of power. But for a deeply intellectual and sensitive individual like Andrew, the role of Boner slowly became a psychological straitjacket. The mechanism of typecasting in the 1980s was absolute. There was no social media to allow actors to show their true personalities. The public only knew what the network broadcasted. For millions of viewers, Andrew Koenig was Boner. They expected him to be stupid, goofy, and eternally cheerful. When fans approached him on the street, they didn't want to discuss his thoughts or his internal life. They wanted him to do the voice, to say a catchphrase, to be the clown they saw on their televisions. The industry itself viewed him through the exact same lens. Casting directors could not look past the character he had so successfully embodied. He was pigeonholed. This profound alienation, being globally recognized but fundamentally misunderstood, acted as an accelerant to a biological condition that Andrew was already quietly battling. Andrew Koenig suffered from severe clinical depression. The trajectory of his illness was accelerated by how mental health was treated, or rather completely ignored, during his rise to fame. In the 1980s and early 1990s, clinical depression was heavily stigmatized. It was not widely discussed in public forums, and certainly not within the highly polished, reputation-obsessed corridors of network television. The prevailing attitude toward depression was not that it was a physiological disease requiring medical intervention, but rather a character flaw, a weakness of will, or a temporary bout of sadness that one simply needed to snap out of. The bitter irony of Growing Pains was that its fictional patriarch, Dr. Jason Seaver, was a psychiatrist. The show frequently dealt with the minor psychological hurdles of adolescence, but the very real, life-threatening clinical depression of one of its core actors was entirely unaddressed. There was no space on a sitcom set for genuine despair. Andrew was required to be on. He was required to generate laughter while his internal chemistry was generating profound, suffocating darkness. The mental toll of having to project extreme goofy happiness while feeling absolute internal emptiness is a specific kind of psychological torture that many comedians and comedic actors endure, often in total isolation. When Growing Pains ended its historic run in 1992, the cast was unceremoniously released into the reality of the 1990s entertainment landscape. For Kirk Cameron, the transition was cushioned by immense wealth and his shifting focus toward religious programming. For others, it was a struggle. For Andrew Koenig, the end of the show meant the loss of structure, but also an opportunity to finally shed the skin of Richard Boners to bone. He sought to redefine himself entirely, refusing to be relegated to the punchline of 80s nostalgia. Andrew directed his sharp intellect and deep empathy toward activism. He became a passionate, dedicated human rights advocate and environmentalist. He did not lend his name to causes simply for positive public relations. He put his physical freedom on the line. Andrew became deeply involved with the U.S. campaign for Burma, now known as Myanmar. He was fiercely dedicated to exposing the atrocities committed by the military junta and advocating for the release of political prisoners. In 2008, his commitment to this cause was broadcast internationally when he was arrested at the Rose Parade in Pasadena, California. During the globally televised event, Andrew boldly stepped in front of a float promoting the Beijing Olympics, holding a sign that drew attention to China's support of the oppressive Burmese regime. This was not the action of a sitcom goofball. This was the action of a man of profound conviction, a man desperate to inject real, tangible meaning into a world he often found superficial and cruel. He also worked behind the camera, writing, directing, and editing independent projects, actively trying to construct a creative identity that honored his intelligence. However, clinical depression does not respect moral convictions or human rights work. It is a biological predator that alters the brain's chemistry, stripping away the ability to feel pleasure, hope, or connection. Despite his activism, despite his family's support, and despite his intelligence, the disease continued to advance. Activism, while providing a temporary sense of purpose, can also expose an empathetic person to the darkest, most traumatic aspects of humanity. For a man already battling a depressive disorder, immersing himself in the suffering of political prisoners and environmental destruction may have compounded his internal despair. As the years progressed into the late 2000s, those close to Andrew noticed a shift. The darkness was becoming more pervasive. He began giving away his possessions, a recognized warning sign in individuals contemplating suicide. He stopped taking certain medications. The pain of existence, the relentless weight of the depression, was simply becoming too heavy to carry. He felt he had exhausted his options. In February 2010, Andrew traveled to Vancouver, British Columbia. He had lived in the city previously and had fond memories of it, describing it to friends as a place where he felt a sense of peace. But this trip was not a vacation. It was a withdrawal. On February 14, 2010, Andrew Koenig was seen at a bakery in Vancouver. After that, he vanished. When he missed a scheduled flight back to Los Angeles on February 16th, his family knew instantly that a catastrophe had occurred. They understood the gravity of his illness. What followed was a massive, desperate, and highly public search. The media, which had largely ignored Andrew's activism and post-sitcom career, suddenly seized upon the narrative. Headlines across North America blared the news. Growing pains, star missing. The contrast between the bright, nostalgic memory of the sitcom and the grim reality of the ongoing search was jarring. Walter Koenig, the beloved Star Trek actor, appeared on national television alongside his wife Judy. The image of this iconic actor looking pale, exhausted, and terrified, pleading directly into the camera for his son to contact them, stripped away any remaining illusion of Hollywood glamour. This was not a television drama. This was the raw, unfiltered agony of parents losing their child to a disease they could not see. The search centered heavily on Stanley Park. Stanley Park is a massive 1,000-acre public park bordering the downtown of Vancouver. It is a place of breathtaking natural beauty, filled with ancient cedar and fir trees, dense undergrowth, and winding trails that can quickly disorient someone unfamiliar with the terrain. It is a place where one can easily become entirely isolated within city limits. Andrew had expressed a deep love for the park in the past. For days, police, search and rescue teams, and volunteers combed the vast expanse of the park. The weather in Vancouver in February is notoriously unforgiving, cold, damp, and penetrating. The physical environment mirrored the psychological landscape Andrew had been navigating for years. On February 25, 2010, 11 days after he was last seen, the agonizing wait came to an end. A private search party, organized by Andrew's father and consisting of close friends, ventured off the main trails and deep into a heavily wooded, secluded area of Stanley Park. It was there, hidden away from the joggers, the tourists, and the cameras, that they found him. Andrew Koenig had hanged himself from a tree. He was 41 years old. The press conference held shortly after the discovery was a moment of devastating clarity. Walter Koenig stood before a bank of microphones, his voice thick with grief, and spoke not about a sitcom star, but about the lethal reality of mental illness. "My son took his own life," he stated plainly, refusing to hide behind euphemisms. He used the moment to speak directly to anyone suffering from depression, begging them to seek help, acknowledging the deceptive nature of the disease that convinces its victims they are beyond saving. The death of Andrew Koenig forced a brutal reckoning upon the legacy of growing pains. The actor, who had been hired to provide the weekly injection of mindless laughter, had died in the most agonizing, silent, and solitary manner possible. The sitcom had presented a world where every problem could be talked through on the living room couch, but the reality of the industry had left one of its own completely abandoned in the dark. The tragedy of Richard Boner Stabone is a testament to the fatal flaw of the 1980s television machine. It demanded the projection of extreme happiness while aggressively ignoring the humanity of the actors providing it. Andrew's death proved that the facade of the perfect TV family was utterly powerless against the realities of clinical illness. Unlike Koenig's silent struggle, Tracy Gold's psychological unraveling was broadcast weekly to millions. It was not a hidden biological illness that the network simply failed to notice. It was a psychological dismantling that the network actively engineered, documented, and broadcasted into millions of living rooms. The destruction of Tracy Gold was written into the scripts, approved by network executives, and performed in front of a live studio audience. It stands today as one of the most glaring indictments of institutionalized body shaming in television history. The specific cruelty of what happened to Tracy Gold was embedded directly into the role she was hired to play. In the heavily structured ecosystem of the 1980s family sitcom, the children were assigned rigid archetypes to maximize comedic friction. If Kirk Cameron's Mike Seaver was the charismatic underachiever, his sister, Carol Seaver, had to be the polar opposite. Carol was the quintessential neurotic overachiever. She was intelligent, anxious, academically driven, and socially awkward. Her character existed primarily to be the foil to Mike's effortless cool. Tracy Gold was uniquely suited for this role. She was a seasoned child actress, having worked in television since she was 4 years old. She understood the mechanics of comedic timing and possessed a natural, relatable charm. In the early seasons of the show, Carol Seaver was a normal, healthy teenager, but as the 1980s progressed, the cultural definition of a normal female body was undergoing a radical and dangerous shift. The late 1980s and early 1990s marked the dawn of an aggressive, omnipresent diet culture. This was the era of the aerobics craze, of Jane Fonda workout tapes, of low-fat dietary crusades, and the rise of the supermodel aesthetic. The ideal female form was becoming increasingly thin, athletic, and devoid of natural body fat. While male actors were allowed to mature into broader frames, female actors were subjected to a microscope. The margin of error for a young woman's body in the public eye was narrowing to an impossible degree. Tracy Gold began growing pains as a young teenager. As the seasons progressed, biology took its natural course. She went through puberty. Between the show's early seasons, she gained a completely normal, biologically necessary amount of weight as her body transitioned from that of a child to a young woman. By any medical standard, she was healthy. By the standards of ordinary American life, she looked entirely normal. But Hollywood operates on a distorted metric. In the eyes of the network executives and the predominantly male writing staff of Growing Pains, Tracy's natural physical development was not a biological milestone. It was a narrative problem. And instead of ignoring it, hiding it, or simply allowing a young woman to exist comfortably in her own skin, the writers decided to weaponize it for cheap laughs. The writer's room of a network sitcom is a highly pressurized environment where the primary currency is the punchline. If a joke gets a laugh at the table read, it stays in the script. The writers noticed that Tracy had gained a slight amount of weight, and they decided that Carol Seaver's body was now a viable target for comedy. Slowly, deliberately, the scripts began to change. Jokes about Carol's eating habits, her weight, and her physical appearance began to infiltrate the dialogue. Mike Seaver, the beloved older brother, was given lines that ruthlessly mocked his sister's size. He would refer to her as a blimp or make exaggerated comments about the amount of food she was consuming. The sheer psychological violence of this scenario becomes apparent when viewing a standard television table read through the eyes of a 19-year-old Tracy Gold. A table read is a weekly event where the entire cast, the writers, the producers, and the network executives sit around a massive conference table and read the upcoming episode script out loud for the first time. It is a terrifying, vulnerable process for any actor. At that table, surrounded by older executives who controlled her career, she was forced to read a script where the core joke was her own body. She had to listen as her castmates delivered lines designed to insult her weight, waiting for the room of adults to erupt into laughter. The psychological dread compounded with the knowledge that in 3 days she would have to stand under bright lights in front of a live studio audience to perform this humiliation before it was permanently broadcast to 20 million Americans. You are not allowed to cry. You are not allowed to object. You are a professional, and you are being paid a massive salary to deliver a service. You must smile, hit your mark, and wait for the laugh track. This creates a profound state of cognitive dissonance. When an authority figure, in this case the entire corporate apparatus of the ABC network, tells a teenager that her body is a joke, the teenager does not question the authority. She questions her body. The verbal abuse, sanctioned by contracts and rewarded by high Nielsen ratings, was internalized by Tracy Gold. The scriptwriters embedded deep psychological insecurities in her mind, while public applause rewarded and reinforced the behavior until it became a life-threatening illness. Tracy decided she needed to lose the weight. Initially, it began as a diet. She wanted to stop the jokes. She wanted the writers to leave her alone. She lost a small amount of weight, returning to the size she was in the earlier seasons. But the nature of an eating disorder is that it is never truly about the weight. It is about control. In an environment where her body was public property, evaluated and mocked by millions, controlling her food intake became the only metric of control she had over her own life. The diet rapidly spiraled into anorexia nervosa. Anorexia is not a vanity project. It is a psychiatric disorder characterized by an obsessive fear of gaining weight and a distorted body image. It is a disease that rewires the brain, turning the biological imperative to eat into a source of absolute terror. Between 1989 and 1991, The audience of Growing Pains watched the physical deterioration of Tracy Gold in real time. The transformation was shocking. The round, healthy face of Carol Seaver became hollow and gaunt. Her collarbones protruded sharply against her wardrobe. The costume department attempted to hide her shrinking frame under bulky, oversized 90s sweaters and layered clothing. But the severity of her illness could not be masked by wardrobe tricks. Tracy was starving herself to death while filming a family comedy. Her daily caloric intake dropped to dangerously low levels. The physical reality of severe anorexia is gruesome. When the body is deprived of fuel, it begins to consume itself to survive. It consumes fat stores and then it begins to consume muscle tissue, including the heart muscle. The resting heart rate plummets. The body's core temperature drops, leading to the growth of a fine, downy hair called lanugo all over the body as it desperately tries to keep itself warm. Brain function slows. Hair falls out in clumps. The organs slowly begin to shut down. By early 1992, during the show's final season, Tracy Gold's weight had plummeted to an estimated 90 pounds. She was a skeleton walking through the vibrant, warmly lit set of the Seaver home. She was physically weak, constantly freezing, and cognitively exhausted, yet she was still expected to hit her marks and deliver punchlines. It was at this critical juncture that the hypocrisy of the television industry reached its absolute peak. The producers and executives, the very people who had authorized the scripts that triggered the illness, suddenly decided that Tracy was a liability. She no longer looked like the relatable sister. She looked like a medical emergency. It was making the audience uncomfortable. The illusion of the healthy American family was being shattered by the undeniable visual evidence of starvation on screen. The network did not shut down production to prioritize her health. They did not restructure the working environment. Instead, they suspended her. Tracy Gold was written out of the majority of the final season of Growing Pains. She was removed from the set because she had become too sick to look at. The message was clear, chilling, and ruthlessly corporate. We will mock you until you break, and when you break, we will fire you for being broken. Tracy was forced into emergency medical treatment. She was fighting a battle for her life, far removed from the fictional safety of Dr. Jason Seaver's home office. She spent the final months of the show's existence in hospitals and therapy, trying to reverse the catastrophic damage done to her body and her mind. She managed to recover enough physical strength to return for the two-part series finale in the spring of 1992, but the image of her in those final episodes remains deeply unsettling. A fragile, haunted survivor standing among her smiling castmates. The series ended, the sets were struck, and the executives moved on to the next profitable venture. But the trauma of verbal abuse and public humiliation does not simply vanish when a television show goes off the air. The psychological scars inflicted during a person's formative years endure, often manifesting in destructive patterns decades later. Tracy Gold survived her battle with anorexia, becoming a vocal advocate for eating disorder awareness, and using her platform to warn others about the dangers of the disease. She wrote books, gave interviews, and attempted to turn her suffering into a tool for education. She married, had children, and built a life away from the toxic environment that nearly killed her. However, trauma is a chronic condition. It is a ghost that lives in the nervous system, waiting for moments of vulnerability to resurface. The coping mechanisms formed during a childhood spent under the crushing pressure of public scrutiny often leave adults ill-equipped to handle the stressors of normal life. This reality manifested tragically on a September night in 2004. Tracy Gold, then 35 years old, was driving an SUV on a California highway. Inside the vehicle were her husband and two of her young sons. Tracy lost control of the vehicle, causing the SUV to roll over the embankment. While her husband and youngest son escaped with minor injuries, her oldest son suffered a broken clavicle. When the California Highway Patrol arrived at the scene, they administered a breathalyzer test. Tracy Gold was arrested and charged with a felony DUI. The media, always hungry for the downfall of a former child star, pounced on the story. The mugshot of the former Carol Seaver was splashed across the internet and tabloid magazines. The narrative was simple and judgmental, another Hollywood child star gone off the rails. But a forensic analysis of a human life requires looking past the police report. The DUI was not an isolated incident of bad judgment. It was the symptom of a deeply fractured foundation. When a child is raised in an environment where their worth is entirely tied to their physical appearance, where their flaws are written into scripts and broadcast for public consumption, and where their resulting mental illness is treated as an inconvenience to the corporate bottom line, they are denied the fundamental building blocks of a healthy adult psyche. Alcohol, like starvation, is a mechanism for numbing pain and exerting a destructive form of control. The woman who crashed that SUV was still carrying the heavy, invisible burden of the teenager who was mocked by the writer's room. The accident was a catastrophic failure of judgment, but it was also a stark reminder that the damage inflicted by the Growing Pains machine was not confined to the 1980s. The psychological damage inflicted upon the cast members during their youth proved to have enduring destructive consequences. Tracy Gold was pushed toward starvation, nearly to the point of cardiac arrest, triggered by the very people employed to write her dialogue. She survived the physical starvation, but the emotional malnutrition she endured on that set left her walking on a tightrope for the rest of her life. The network used her body as a punchline, extracted the maximum amount of profit from her presence, and discarded her when the collateral damage became too visible. While Gold internalized the set's toxicity, another cast member learned to weaponize it. As the 1980s drew to a close, the charming, rebellious teenager who anchored the show's massive popularity underwent a radical transformation. He did not succumb to depression or eating disorders. Instead, he found a different kind of obsession, one that allowed him to cloak his ego in the impenetrable armor of divine authority. The good boy of American television was about to become a pious tyrant, and he was ready to purge anyone who stood in his righteous path. The transition of the Growing Pains set from a high-functioning television production into an ideological dictatorship was driven by the specific economic leverage of the teen idol in late 1980s media. In the modern era of fragmented audiences and infinite streaming options, it is difficult to grasp the monolithic cultural power a single network television star wielded in 1987. There were only 3 major broadcasting networks in the United States. When a show was a hit, it did not just reach a niche demographic, It commanded the attention of a massive percentage of the American population simultaneously. At the absolute epicenter of this cultural monopoly was Kirk Cameron. Kirk Cameron did not just play Mike Seaver. By the second season, he effectively was the franchise. He was receiving upwards of 10,000 pieces of fan mail a week. His face was the primary engine driving magazine sales for publications like Tiger Beat, Bop, and 16 Magazine. He was generating millions of dollars in ancillary merchandise, from posters to board games. Most importantly, his presence guaranteed the viewership of the highly coveted female demographic, aged 12 to 24, which in turn allowed the ABC network to charge astronomical rates for commercial advertising during the show's broadcast slot. In the ruthless calculus of Hollywood economics, Kirk Cameron was no longer viewed as a teenage employee. He was a multi-million-dollar corporate asset. The network executives, the producers, and the writers all knew a fundamental truth. The show could survive the departure of almost any cast member, but if Kirk Cameron walked away, the entire financial apparatus would collapse. This dynamic created a terrifying imbalance of power. The adults in the room, the seasoned producers, the veteran actors like Alan Thicke and Joanna Kearns, the network executives in their corporate suites, were entirely dependent on the continued cooperation of a 17-year-old boy. It is within this volatile environment of unchecked teenage power that the most disturbing psychological shift in the show's history occurred. At age 17, Kirk Cameron experienced a sudden, radical, and totalizing religious conversion. He became a born-again evangelical Christian. Historically, spiritual awakenings are often deeply personal, internal journeys toward empathy, understanding, and personal peace. But within the high-pressure, ego-driven environment of a Hollywood soundstage, a sudden injection of fundamentalist certainty can act as a dangerous psychological accelerant. For Kirk Cameron, religion did not appear to function as a tool for personal humility. Instead, it became an impenetrable armor for his ego, a moral justification for absolute control, and a weapon with which he could dominate his environment. The transformation was immediate and jarring. The charismatic, easygoing teenager who used to joke with the crew and socialize with his castmates vanished. He was replaced by an austere, judgmental figure who viewed his workplace not as a collaborative, artistic environment, but as a den of secular iniquity that needed to be purged. He physically and emotionally isolated himself from the rest of the cast. Tracy Gold, who was already beginning to suffer under the weight of her own network-sanctioned verbal abuse, later noted the freezing of their relationship. The cast, who had functioned as a tight-knit surrogate family for years, suddenly found themselves being evaluated and condemned by their youngest star. Kirk began retreating to his dressing room, refusing to engage in normal set camaraderie. But the isolation was only the first phase. The true manifestation of his newfound power was directed at the scripts. The production of a weekly sitcom operates on a strict, relentless schedule. The writers generate a script, the cast reads it on Monday, they rehearse it for 3 days, and they shoot it on Friday. It is a machine that cannot afford friction. Kirk Cameron began throwing wrenches into this machine on a daily basis. He started bringing a moral red pen to the table reads. Operating under his new fundamentalist guidelines, Kirk began systematically rejecting the dialogue and actions written for Mike Seaver. He refused to say lines that included the word God as an exclamation, viewing it as blasphemy. He refused to participate in storylines where his character lied to his parents without immediate severe punishment. He began scrutinizing the physical actions required of him, refusing to share a bed with female characters, and ultimately refusing to even kiss his on-screen romantic interests unless he deemed the context morally pure. For the writers and producers, this was a logistical nightmare. They were hired to write a comedy about a rebellious girl-crazy teenager. The fundamental premise of Mike Seaver's character was his charming roguishness. Suddenly, the actor playing him was demanding that the character be rewritten as a puritanical moralist. In a standard workplace, an employee who outright refuses to perform the basic duties of their job would be disciplined or terminated. But in the inverted power structure of Growing Pains, the executives caved. Terrified of losing their golden goose, the network instructed the writers to accommodate Kirk's demands. The storylines were altered, the edge was sanded down, the dialogue was sanitized. A teenager was dictating the creative direction of a multi-million-dollar network property based entirely on his personal theological awakening. This capitulation emboldened Cameron. He realized that his religious convictions, when combined with his economic leverage, gave him absolute dictatorial power over the production. He was no longer just an actor. He was the moral arbiter of the show, and he was about to use that power to ruthlessly execute the career of a young woman who did not meet his standard of purity. The defining incident of Kirk Cameron's pious tyranny centers on an actress named Julie McCulla. By the show's fourth season in 1988, the producers realized that the character of Mike Seaver needed to mature. He could not remain a high school slacker forever. They decided to introduce a serious, long-term romantic interest to anchor his storylines and appeal to an older demographic. They created the character of Julie Costello, a college student who also worked as a nanny. They cast Julie McCulla, a 23-year-old actress with sharp comedic timing and undeniable screen presence. The introduction of Julie Costello was a massive success. The chemistry between McCulla and Cameron on screen was electric. The audience responded overwhelmingly positively to the relationship. The ratings, which always dictate the direction of television narrative, reflected this success. The producers promoted McCulla to a series regular. The narrative arc was set. Mike Seaver was going to grow up, and he was going to marry Julie Costello. Scripts were drafted for a highly publicized, ratings-grabbing wedding episode. But there was a piece of information in Julie McCulloch's past that the producers knew, but the teenage moral arbiter of the show did not. In 1986, 3 years before she was cast on Growing Pains, Julie McCulla had posed as a centerfold for Playboy magazine. In the context of the 1980s entertainment industry, this was not a scandalous secret. Playboy was a massive mainstream cultural institution. Countless actresses, models, and public figures posed for the magazine as a strategic stepping stone to build their profiles and transition into mainstream acting. The producers of Growing Pains were fully aware of her pictorial when they hired her. They did not care. She was a talented comedic actress who tested well with audiences. Her past as a model had absolutely no bearing on her ability to perform her job. However, when Kirk Cameron discovered this information, the reaction was catastrophic. For a fundamentalist who was already attempting to sanitize the entire production, The revelation that he was simulating a romantic relationship with a former Playboy model was an ideological emergency. It did not matter that they were simply acting. It did not matter that her past was legal, common in the industry, and irrelevant to the scripts. To Kirk, Julie McCulla's presence was a moral contagion. He did not attempt to have a professional conversation with her. He did not extend the Christian concepts of grace or forgiveness that he so publicly championed. Instead, he bypassed his castmates, bypassed the immediate producers, and went directly to the top of the ABC network hierarchy. He issued a stark, non-negotiable ultimatum. Either Julie McCulla is fired, or Kirk Cameron leaves Growing Pains. This is the moment where the moral bankruptcy of the Hollywood studio system is laid bare. Faced with a choice between protecting an innocent employee from a discriminatory, religious-based firing or protecting their advertising revenue, the ABC network executives did not hesitate. They calculated the math. Julie McCulla was a rising star, but she was expendable. Kirk Cameron was the franchise. The corporate cowardice was absolute. Despite the fact that her character was the central focus of the season's narrative arc, despite the fact that a wedding had already been planned and heavily promoted to the public, the network folded to the demands of a radicalized teenager. Julie McCulla was fired. The execution of this firing was brutal in its abruptness. There was no graceful exit negotiated. The writers were forced into a chaotic scramble to rewrite the entire season trajectory. The highly anticipated wedding episode was hastily transformed into a breakup episode. On screen, the audience watched in confusion as the relationship between Mike and Julie, which had been built up over an entire season, disintegrated in a single poorly written episode. Julie Costello abruptly leaves Mike Seaver at the altar, citing vague, unconvincing reasons about not being ready for commitment. She walks out the door of the Seaver home and she is never seen or mentioned again. Off-screen, the reality was much darker. Julie McCulla's career was derailed. She had landed the coveted role of a series regular on a top 10 network sitcom, a life-changing career milestone, only to have it ripped away not because of a lack of talent, not because of poor behavior, but because a teenage co-star decided she was morally impure. The psychological toll of this public, humiliating dismissal was severe. McCulla was effectively shunned by a production she had helped elevate. The narrative leaked to the press, framing the firing around her Playboy past, subjecting her to public judgment and a modern-day scarlet letter. She was punished for the hypocrisy of an industry that profits off the objectification of young women, only to condemn them when a powerful male star decides to weaponize his piety. Kirk Cameron had successfully executed a corporate purge. He had proven that his religious fundamentalism superseded employment contracts, narrative logic, and basic human decency. He had used his power to unilaterally destroy a colleague's livelihood, and the network had rewarded him by allowing it to happen. The firing of Julie McCulla cemented a toxic, fear-based atmosphere on the set of Growing Pains. The message to the remaining cast and crew was unmistakable. Kirk Cameron is untouchable, and his moral judgment is the law. If he could force the network to fire a series regular over a 3-year-old magazine pictorial, no one was safe. The warm, supportive environment of the fictional Seaver family had become an off-screen autocracy. Alan Thicke, the veteran actor playing the empathetic psychiatrist father, was forced to stand by and watch a teenager dismantle the professional integrity of the workplace. Tracy Gold, already fighting a desperate, quiet war against starvation, had to navigate a set where the leading man was actively policing the morality of his coworkers. Kirk Cameron's trajectory on Growing Pains is a chilling case study in the anatomy of toxic power. He did not become a tyrant despite his good boy image. He used his good boy image as the very mechanism of his tyranny. He demonstrated how easily religious dogma can be stripped of its spirituality and repurposed as a tool for corporate bullying. He played a character beloved for his charm and harmless rebellion, while operating in reality as a cold, calculating authoritarian who viewed the destruction of a young woman's career as a righteous victory. The Growing Pains curse was not a supernatural phenomenon. It was a series of deliberate human choices. It was the choice of writers to mock a teenage girl into starvation. It was the choice of a network to ignore a comedian's lethal depression. And it was the choice of executives to hand absolute unchecked power to a fundamentalist teenager, allowing him to play God with the lives of the people around him. As the 1980s bled into the early 1990s, the cultural landscape of the United States was undergoing a seismic shift. The unbridled optimism and sanitized family values that defined the Reagan era were rapidly losing their grip on the public consciousness. A new decade was dawning, bringing with it a wave of cynicism, grunge music, and a demand for a more grounded, realistic portrayal of American life. Television was evolving. Audiences were beginning to gravitate toward the dysfunctional realism of shows like Roseanne and Married with Children, leaving the pristine, problem-free living room of the Seaver family looking increasingly like a relic of a bygone era. Inside the sound stages of the ABC network, the producers of Growing Pains were acutely aware of this shifting demographic tide. The show was losing its cultural relevance, and the ratings were beginning a slow, inevitable decline. But instead of allowing the series to conclude gracefully, the network executives engaged in a desperate, frantic campaign of corporate self-preservation. They were determined to wring every last drop of advertising revenue out of the franchise, regardless of the human cost. This relentless pursuit of profit forced the production into its darkest and most psychologically damaging phase, the final seasons. The surreal horror of the Growing Pains set between 1990 and 1992 extended beyond the afflicted teenage stars to the complicity of the adults in the room. The narrative of the show rested entirely on the shoulders of Dr. Jason Seaver and Maggie Seaver, played by Alan Thicke and Joanna Kearns. On screen, they were the ultimate parental safety net, perceptive, empathetic, and always ready to intervene when their children stumbled. Off-screen, however, they were veteran actors trapped in an unprecedented ethical nightmare. Alan Thicke was, by all accounts, a genuinely kind, intelligent, and affable man. He was a seasoned television professional, a successful talk show host, and a prolific songwriter. He was not a tyrant, nor was he an abuser. Joanna Kearns was a highly respected, disciplined actress who brought a necessary grounding to the show's comedic premises. Yet their presence on the set highlights one of the most insidious aspects of the Hollywood studio system, the phenomenon of systemic complicity and the bystander effect. When a multi-million-dollar corporate apparatus is functioning, the individuals within that apparatus are heavily incentivized to look away from its collateral damage. Thicke and Kearns arrived at work every day to a set that was visibly deteriorating. They sat at the table reads where the writers actively drafted jokes mocking Tracy Gold's weight. They stood under the studio lights and watched as she physically withered away, her collarbones protruding, her energy flatlining, her body consumed by an eating disorder that the show itself had helped trigger. They watched as Kirk Cameron transformed from a collaborative scene partner into a hostile ideological dictator who actively policed the morality of the crew and successfully orchestrated the firing of a fellow actress. How do intelligent, compassionate adults rationalize working in such an environment? The answer lies in the deeply compartmentalized nature of the television industry. In Hollywood, the chain of command is absolute. Actors, even the adult leads of a hit sitcom, are ultimately employees. They do not write the scripts, they do not manage the human resources department, and they do not dictate network policy. Intervening in the mental health crises of their younger co-stars or challenging the abusive behavior of the show's biggest draw would mean disrupting the production, antagonizing the network executives, and potentially jeopardizing the livelihoods of the hundreds of crew members who depended on the show for their weekly paychecks. The adults utilized a psychological survival mechanism common in high-stress corporate environments. They compartmentalized. They treated the set strictly as a workplace. They hit their marks, delivered their lines, collected their substantial paychecks, and went home to their real families. But the cognitive dissonance required to maintain this professional detachment must have been staggering. Alan Thicke was earning a fortune playing a fictional psychiatrist who could diagnose and cure a teenager's anxiety in a single conversation, while standing mere feet away from a real teenager who was starving herself to death and another who was suffering from the clinical depression that would eventually claim his life. This silent complicity from the adults reinforced the isolation of the younger cast members. For Tracy Gold, seeing the parents of the set read the fat-shaming jokes without protest validated the abuse. For Kirk Cameron, the lack of pushback from the veteran actors solidified his belief that his religious authority superseded professional boundaries. The set became a vacuum of accountability. By the seventh and final season, which began airing in the fall of 1991, the internal rot of growing pains was no longer something that could be hidden behind the scenes. It was actively bleeding into the narrative structure of the show. Tracy Gold was pulled from the production to seek emergency medical treatment for her severe anorexia, leaving a glaring absence in the family dynamic. The writers, unable to address the reality of her illness without admitting their own culpability, fabricated flimsy excuses for Carol Seaver's sudden disappearance, sending the character off to a study program in London. The heart of the family's intellectual conflict was gone, replaced by a haunting void. Simultaneously, the network was facing a massive crisis regarding their golden boy, Kirk Cameron. While he still retained a dedicated core of fundamentalist fans, his mainstream appeal as a teen idol had evaporated. The teenage girls who had plastered his face on their bedroom walls in 1986 were now entering college. They were listening to Nirvana and Pearl Jam. They were no longer interested in a 21-year-old actor who publicly preached about premarital purity and refused to kiss his co-stars. Furthermore, Cameron's constant demands for script rewrites and his refusal to engage in standard sitcom storylines had made him a logistical nightmare to work with. He had aged out of his demographic, and he had alienated his industry. The executives at ABC found themselves in a terrifying position. The show was hemorrhaging viewers. One of their female leads was in a hospital bed fighting for her life, and their primary male draw had become an ideological liability. The machine was breaking down. Their solution was not to end the show, but to initiate a classic cynical television maneuver, the Cousin Oliver syndrome. They needed to inject fresh, untainted youth into the dying franchise to attract a new generation of teenage viewers and mask the exhaustion of the veteran cast. They needed a new controllable asset to distract the audience from the fact that the Seaver family was falling apart. Enter a 16-year-old actor named Leonardo DiCaprio. In 1991, DiCaprio was largely unknown to the general public. He was a raw, incredibly charismatic teenager who had been bouncing around in commercials and minor television roles. The producers of Growing Pains cast him as Luke Brower, a homeless teenager who is discovered living in the Seaver family's garage and is promptly taken in by the ever-benevolent Dr. Jason Seaver. The introduction of Luke Brower was a masterclass in narrative manipulation. By bringing a homeless youth into the pristine suburban home, the show attempted to manufacture a sense of progressive relevance, a nod to the social issues of the early 90s. But beneath the surface, it was a ruthless corporate strategy to replace Kirk Cameron. DiCaprio possessed exactly what Cameron had lost: a dangerous, effortless, and entirely secular cool. He was edgy where Cameron was sanitized. He was a naturalistic actor where Cameron had become rigid and rehearsed. The teenage magazines immediately sensed the shift. The covers that had once been the exclusive domain of Kirk Cameron were suddenly dominated by the striking blonde-haired newcomer. The dynamic on the set during this transition was uniquely grim. Young Leonardo DiCaprio was thrust into a heavily fractured psychological environment, walking onto a soundstage that had been home to these people for 7 years. He was joining a family, but it was a family in the terminal stages of dysfunction. He was the shiny new replacement part in a broken machine. He was acting opposite Kirk Cameron, a man who undoubtedly recognized that this new teenager was hired specifically to usurp his throne and capture his former demographic. He was performing in the physical space where Tracy Gold had collapsed from starvation, surrounded by a crew that had been conditioned by years of fear and compliance to Cameron's dictates. He was working with adult actors who were simply trying to survive the final contractual hours of a dying show. DiCaprio, recognizing the toxic inertia of the production, used the show exactly as the network used him, as a stepping stone. He delivered his lines with a naturalism that starkly contrasted with the dated sitcom rhythms of the rest of the cast. He survived the environment by remaining an outsider, insulated by his own undeniable rising trajectory. He did not become entangled in the ideological wars or the psychological breakdowns. He simply did his job and waited for the escape hatch. The filming of the final episodes of Growing Pains in the spring of 1992 was an exercise in surreal manufactured nostalgia. The scripts forced the characters into contrived emotional resolutions, wrapping up 7 years of television history with neat, digestible bows. Tracy Gold was permitted to return from her medical leave for a brief, heavily monitored appearance in the two-part finale. She looked fragile, her presence a stark visual reminder of the show's dark legacy, despite the thick layers of makeup and the carefully chosen wardrobe designed to hide her recovering frame. When the director called cut on the final scene of the series finale, the reaction from the cast and crew was not the tearful, joyous celebration typical of a long-running television show. It was, according to those present, a profound and heavy exhale. It was the release of a pressure valve that had been building for nearly a decade. There was no grand, unifying wrap party where the cast reminisced about the golden years. The familial bonds that the network had spent millions of dollars promoting to the public simply did not exist. The actors retreated to their dressing rooms, packed up their belongings, and walked away from the Seaver house set for the final time. Kirk Cameron immediately distanced himself from Hollywood, diving fully into the world of evangelical Christian ministry and production, leaving his mainstream career behind without looking back. Tracy Gold faced a long, arduous, and highly public battle with her eating disorder and the subsequent traumas that would culminate in her DUI arrest a decade later. Andrew Koenig walked out into the 1990s, struggling to find his footing, carrying the invisible weight of a depression that the industry had ignored, moving slowly toward that freezing park in Vancouver. The sets were dismantled. The soundstage was cleared for the next sitcom. The executives at ABC tallied the syndication profits, completely insulated from the human wreckage left in their wake. They had successfully sold the American public a lie, and they had extracted the physical and psychological health of their young employees to manufacture it. But the story of Growing Pains does not end when the cameras were turned off in 1992. The true legacy of the show is not found in the reruns that still play on obscure cable channels. It is found in the enduring systemic nature of the industry that created it. The mechanics of exploitation did not disappear when the Seaver family went off the air. They simply evolved, waiting for a new generation of children to feed into the machine. The conclusion of Growing Pains in 1992 marked the end of an era for network television, but it did not mark the end of the trauma for the people who lived inside its machinery. When a television show wraps, the physical set is dismantled, the fake walls are taken down, the prop couches are placed in storage, the studio lights are extinguished. But the psychological architecture built during those years remains deeply entrenched within the minds of the cast. The young actors were expelled from the high-pressure environment of the ABC soundstage and thrown into a reality for which they were entirely unprepared. They were emotionally malnourished, their internal compasses shattered by years of public scrutiny, verbal abuse, and unchecked manipulation. Growing Pains left a legacy defined less by its syndication success and more by the severe toll it took on its young cast. It exposes an entertainment apparatus that viewed adolescent development as a narrative obstacle and human well-being as secondary to advertising revenue. When we look back at the defining family sitcoms of the 1980s, we are forced to confront the actual cost of that manufactured innocence. The perfect television family was a highly profitable illusion maintained by the silent, untelevised suffering of the youth hired to portray it.